Welcome to tonight's webinar, Cultivating Curiosity with Center for Inspired Teaching. Tonight we're going to be talking about relationship building and how we can begin the school year with connection. My name is Jenna and I work with Center for Inspired Teaching. Center for Inspired Teaching is an organization that has been working with teachers in Washington, D.C. and beyond since 1995. The way that we approach our work is by aiming to create a space where every child and teacher loves coming to school. So that's our goal. That's what we're working towards. And we focus on helping you to create classrooms that center intellect, inquiry, and imagination and integrity in every day and every learning experience. And do that through these circles you see on the outside: mutual respect, centering the student as an expert, creating learning experiences that are driven by purpose, persistence, and action, focusing on joy, something that we all need, not only in our work, but in our learning and in our life beyond school. And then thinking about multiple ways, looking at wide-ranging evidence of student learning and looking at all the different ways that we can learn from and with our students. So tonight we're going to jump into that, thinking about what it means to focus on relationship building in the beginning of the school year. Tonight, we're going to talk about activities that use something called asset framing as a tool for getting to know our students. We're going to talk about ways to create structures in your day that can facilitate more two-way communication with families, because families are really important to the relationships that we build in and beyond our classrooms. And then towards the end, we'll actually think about the classroom as a physical space and pay attention to the different ways that we might set up that physical space to facilitate sharing and learning about one another. And I want to really emphasize that idea of learning about one another, so opportunities for us to learn about our students, but also for our students to learn about us. And what we're going to talk about tonight in terms of relationship building, we won't go back to this too much, but I want to start by saying that it is grounded in a lot of the concepts that you see here. That when we are working on building strong relationships with our students, we are building self-awareness. We are thinking about creating the foundation for students to build self-management and responsible decision-making and social awareness. So those relationship skills have implications for all of the learning that takes place in our classroom. And if you are working in a place where there's an expectation to focus on social and emotional learning, hopefully everything that we discussed tonight will feel very relevant to that. What I wanted to start with was just learning from folks who are in the room some of your go-to strategies that you already use to build relationships.
Hi, I'm Sabrina Burrows. I'm a kindergarten teacher at John Lewis Elementary School here in Washington, D.C. Some of the things that are working for me is basically letting the students kind of drive the car in their social and emotional development and kind of have their own self-reflection, self-regulation. So I have what I call a Zen zone in my classroom. And with that Zen zone, I have different resources there so students can kind of modify their thoughts and feelings. They don't have to tell me that they need to take a break. It's their access. So they use the take the break signal where they're clapping their two fingers together, and they don't have to say, Miss Burrows, I need a break. They just tap their clappers, and we do that in our first 6 weeks of school. We establish what that looks and sounds like. I do a guided discovery with the tools. I put them in a shoebox. Shoebox doesn't have any kind of markings or anything. It's just plain old box. But I get really excited about it, kind of get that spirit jumping up and down. I put resources in there like fidgets. I'll put a timer in there so the students know that they can't stay out there all day. There's a time limit. Would like them to, regulate, but there's a time limit. They gotta get back to learning. There's stuffy, something soft in there so they can, hold on to it. I do sanitize it on the regular. This year I'm adding in thank you notes and thought notes that have little messages on there. I have these cool little messages that I've put in frames that I'm sharing in that Zen zone as well. And my favorite thing, which I was telling Jenna about that I just pulled out of my resources, is my new relaxation ball. It's kind of neat. It looks like this. So it glows. I don't know if you can see, but it's turned green, which is when they breathe. It's turned yellow. You hold that deep breath in, and then it turns blue and you breathe out. So that's going to be one of my Zen Zone tools that I'm using, or resources that I'm using this year. you always want to spice it up. So I'm spicing it up with also um, adding in a peer-to-peer talk, person that they can talk to, a peer. So if they don't want to go to the Zen zone by themselves, if they're having a tough time, they can choose a buddy to kind of come in with them, to take that 3-minute break from learning and maybe talk about their feelings, because some feelings are little and some feelings are really really big. And if they're really really big, that's something that maybe we can talk about together. But while I'm in instruction, I'm going to gift that duty to one of those students who likes to be heard, um, to be a good listener. So we're going to have that talking person be use that listening tool and that empathy access. So what works in my classroom is also after recess we have decompression time where they come in, and when they cross that threshold they have 7,000 things they want to tell me. But after they come in, we take our deep breath, we do a little bit of meditation, then they can get those feelings out when they take their water break, and they just collapse their morning. And then all of a sudden some of those feelings go away, but some of those feelings that are still there, that decompression helps to get us back on track for the rest of the learning day.
But your school, you also do home visits, right?
Yes, we do home visits. Actually, I've just got my class list on Friday, and I'm doing a welcome note. Like, hi, I'm your child's teacher. I also do a before school story. I will have a family wall this year, with pictures of all the family members in a little kind of paper house set up. So it feels like home, and it feels like if they need that connection to home, our homes are always going to be a part of our classroom community. I'm building a lot of kindness and a lot of comfort in my classroom as I'm growing as a teacher, because this is my 19th year I'm loading, but in my second career, but I'm still learning and still growing within that journey.
Hi, I'm Meg Campos. I'm the project manager for Inspired Teaching, but I also have more than a decade of experience in education as a teacher and then as a learning specialist. I worked with first through third grades ELA, and then I ended with seventh and eighth grade ELA. So my more recent experience has been with middle schoolers, and sometimes making those connections is a very different approach with middle school than it is with early childhood, because they're now reaching this age of wanting more autonomy and wanting to not be not cool. And so, you have to meet them where they are, because it takes a little bit of trust and a little bit of deeper respect and communication with them to prove to them that they're safe before they'll really open up. So, a big thing that I found success with when I was working with them with our introductions was I gave them a choice board, because that allowed them to be able to choose what worked best for them and the way that they wanted to introduce themselves to the class. And each of the choices on the board was attached to some type of art. And so one was music, one was poetry, one was like a drawing thing. And they got to decide, as long as they touched the key points on the checklist of what I wanted them to say about themselves, that they could figure out how they were going to introduce themselves to the class. And that might have looked like making a playlist to introduce themselves or writing a poem to introduce themselves. But I found so much success, not only with them actually completing it, but also with them being really excited to share, because they were making those connections. But digging a little deeper, when I made the choice board, I was very intentional about finding things that are very relevant to middle schoolers, different artists that are really popular right now, and memes that they're seeing or games that they're playing. And I tried to connect that into my presentation of the choice board to the kids, so that they could tell that I was putting in energy and effort into learning about the things that they are interested in, and then showing them that I care for that and I respect that within them. So it was a really great way to connect and introduce ourselves.
Oh, I love that. And I love that within that, the students have the autonomy to be able to make like they're practicing, they're just like we talked about with that, the castle framework, there was decision making in there. They had that opportunity to practice that and decide how they wanted to share who they were with other people. I went and just did a quick search for recent posts on the internet about relationship building, but I was looking at it not in terms of schools, but in terms of professional life in general, because I wanted to put these up here for us all to think of, to notice where there's overlap, both in the recommendations that are out there, and then also how these might connect to or be different from ways that we think about relationship building in the classroom. So just take a minute to look at these. What's standing out to you? What are you noticing?
The language really mimics professional relationships. I mean, professional verbs like you're doing work to make the relationships work. You're putting in effort.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like um it reminds me of like the factory type
Mm-hmm.
language, like
Mm-hmm.
this is what we need to get done. Set aside time to do this, and you need to manage your time, and you need to focus, and you need, it's these verbs of like being efficient, but they mimic work professional verbs.
Yeah. Yeah.
And my thought is there's a lot of assumption that people actually know how to do that. Like,
Mm-hmm.
number 4 under mind tools, practice mindful listening. Great to say it, but it's a whole different thing to actually understand what that means, what that looks like, what is required. It relates to what Sabrina does in her classroom, which is the guide to discovery and the social story that sort of leads her children to understanding it, and they practice it, and then they come, so what's missing here in part is the how these things get accomplished, and it requires that explicit teaching, which we know in our classrooms.
Yeah.
I was drawing on something I always say to my students, parents, and my coworkers. I work at Center City Public Charter School here in Washington, D.C. And under Forbes, #1, communication is key. You have to communicate, have to, especially when speaking with parents of students who's they might be their very first year in a public school system. You have to communicate with them to keep them abreast of everything that's going on within the classroom so that they can be comfortable with knowing that they made a good choice of leaving their students, their children, in the care of another teacher. And that's just me.
Yeah.
I communicate about every single thing to the parents.
One thing that shows up here, but that shows up even more in our classrooms, is that in order to build a relationship, another thing that's kind of assumed here that's not necessarily stated explicitly, is that we have to actually get to know one another. But learning how to know each other in authentic ways really creates that foundation for being able to have those relationships. So tonight we're going to both dig deep and get specific about what that means. At the start of the school year, as you head into the new year, or as you head into your classroom, Sabrina just talked about getting her lists. And if we're not the very first grade in our school, we usually are at a grade where we're going to take on a class of students that there's already some known information about them. There's the data that the school has about them that we might have access to, but that doesn't necessarily give us any sort of a picture as to who the students really are. And I think we all probably have been part of the situations where you might ask their previous teacher some questions. Sometimes that's helpful, but sometimes that also can paint a picture in our head of what their experience was with the student that isn't necessarily what our experience is going to be with the student. And I want to share with you something that has been really meaningful to us at Inspired Teaching over the last couple of years, which is a concept called asset framing. And it talks about why just getting, data, just getting numbers, here's the student's reading score, here's the student's math score, here's what their attendance was last year, here's here's how many disciplinary infractions they had last year, how that data does end up triggering thoughts in our minds or ways that we understand the student, but it isn't really the best way for us to actually understand who the student is. And particularly if we have students that are coming into our care that maybe have a reputation, or that we might have had their brother or their sister, and that gives us an idea of what they're going to be like. All of these things create patterns in our brains before we've actually met our students. And asset framing is actually a way to flip that on its head and say, let's start from a different place. If we need to get to know our students to build relationships with them, let's think about this in a slightly different way. So I'm going to share with you a few minutes of a conversation that we had with a fellow named Trabian Shorters, who has actually been doing a lot of work with asset framing. And as you're listening to this, just think about how what he's talking about in terms of how we construct stories, how data does or doesn't give us information, how those pieces of what he's sharing relate to your experience at the beginning of the school year when you are working to build relationships with your students.
I teach asset framing to heads of major foundations, corporations, associations around the world. And the reason why I think there's so much attraction to it is that asset framing is not about any particular moral stance. It's not about how to be kinder or nicer or any of those things that are just driven by the goodness of your nature. Asset framing is rooted in cognitive science. So what we discovered was, I didn't discover it, Daniel Kahneman and other Nobel laureates who work in cognitive science, what they discovered was human beings cannot be data-driven. It's something we are literally incapable of. What we are is narrative-driven. Our mental models tell us which data to pay attention to, right? Which information matters and which information doesn't. So if you understand that in reality, we only measure the data that our mental model tells us matters, then we're not data-driven, we are narrative-driven. The narrative matters more than the facts because the narrative tells you which facts to pay attention to. So if you understand that, then the question of which narratives are we operating out of, what are our mental models, right, becomes hugely important because we literally see what we look for. Human beings literally see what we look for. So asset framing is about the cognitive science of our social behaviors, right? Now, if we understand that, then what we realized is when your associations, when the narratives that are most easily accessible by your mind are primarily negative ones, then you innately treat whoever's at the center of that narrative as threatening. It is not a decision. It is not a choice. It is a physiological response to something where the threat value or the negative value or the potential problem value is easy for your brain to recall. When that happens, your body says, oh, what can I do to avoid this threat? What can I do to reduce this threat? What can I do to eliminate this threat? We call it avoid, control, kill. And this shows up in all kinds of issues, across human beings. But when you think about how we relate to our children, if what we know about our children, if we prime our mind, right, the first thing that comes to our mind is something about a gap, a deficit, a failing, a lack, a need, or an inability. If those are the first things that come to our mind, we don't code that child as familiar, as one of us. We code that child as potential problem or current problem. And so we must first address their problematic nature before we can make them one of us, which means our relationship to them is actually about, it's the same relationship you have when you discover a spider crawling on your floor, or that's actually the initial shock is, oh, spider. You got to do something about the spider, right? And so you can avoid the spider, you can control the spider, you can kill the spider, right? But you have to address the spider first before you can think about anything else. And so what the science shows us is when you relate to people that way, you get a certain level of response. When you relate to them first by their aspiration, their contribution, these things that remind you innately that they are a human being, that they are one of the bus, they're familiar.
So just first impressions about asset framing with what he shared right there. How does that speak to you when you're thinking about starting the school year or meeting new students for the first time?
I mean, it's what I would want every child to have access to, on the planet. I would want that for every child, that the adults around them start with all that we know that is, their potential and their gift and their talent. And that's just where we start.
Yeah. Love this notion of asset framing because it's shifted my awareness of the ways in which I don't always asset frame, the ways in which the situations in which, particularly if I'm engaging with somebody that I might need to work with, that might present a challenge to me. Am I having what Trabian describes there in terms of that sort of spider reaction? Or am I starting from a place of thinking about what their aspirations are, what their contributions are? So the next little clip I'm going to share right here is the oh, okay, now what? So then what do I do with that information? And he's going to share the strategy for how to begin with asset framing, and then we'll think about how that can play out in the work that we do in our classrooms.
Because we're mental model driven, you're better served to construct your model before you encounter the trigger. So all the folks who teach habit change, they point out like you have to have a response to your habit trigger before you encounter the habit trigger. So it's the same thing, right? So because we're narrative driven, there's 4 questions that you can ask yourself that will help you construct a more holistic mental model about whoever it is. And, we're applying this to children, but this works in everything. Like I invite people to take the 100-day asset framing challenge. Just practice asset framing stuff and give your heart a lift. But so the 4 questions that are great for giving your brain this cognitive skill. Number 1, what do you love about whoever's at the center of the question? This can be people, this can be places, this can be the environment. Like I've done this in a lot of different ways, but literally identifying what is it that you deeply admire and love. And I know that sounds not scientific, but here's why you do that. You identify what you love because your intuition, the autonomic system is immediate. And so once you trigger feelings of affection, you're more prone to actually see the positive aspects than if you've never bothered to create that priming, right? So first prime yourself, like literally, what is your affect for whoever or whatever? And if you can identify something that you love, then you ask the next 3 questions. Then you ask, what are their aspirations? Like what gets them up in the morning? And again, having primed what you love, you will see more aspirations than if you hadn't done the first step. You'll see more positive things than if you hadn't done the first step, right? So 1, what do you really love, admire? 2, what are their aspirations? What are their contributions? And you want to find aspirations and contributions that are kind of tent poles, like things that really stick out, just because that'll help your brain recall them faster. Then 3rd question is, what is obstructing their aspirations? If they want to grow up and contribute meaningfully to society, what is obstructing that? That's the 3rd question. And then the 4th question is, what are you going to do to be an asset to them? What are you going to do to help them realize their aspirations? Like put yourself, rather than in the role of the hero and the guide, the sort of leader, put yourself in the role of maybe the resource, the asset. How are you going to be an asset to them and their aspiration? Once you figure those things out, it's a lot easier for your brain to pick on the right tools, the right methodologies, the right inspirations. But just those 4 steps make you better able to asset frame and guide and lead.
So these are the 4 questions that Travian just talked about. And I'm going to invite you just to play a little bit with asset framing right now. And as we head back to school, we're building relationships with our students, but let's be honest, a huge part of the relationship building is also the other people that we're working with in the building, the other adults. Maybe we co-teach, maybe we have an assistant teacher in our classroom, maybe we have to have some interesting conversations with our administrators, or we have partnerships with outside organizations that come in and do things in our classroom. So I know you haven't met your students yet, unless you're looping, but consider these questions in relation to a person you are working to build a relationship with. So what do you love about this person? What are their aspirations and contributions? What is obstructing their aspirations? And how can you be an asset to them?
If it's okay, I'll share, Jenna.
Please.
Funny thing, when I first heard the video and I was listening to it, as far as the asset framing was involved, I was thinking of my students, and I'm thinking, well, this is something I already do. But then when you said, think about the people that you work with, and I'm thinking adults, I'm like, okay, that puts it in a whole nother light, a different perspective, because I have this bond that I establish with my students, but I don't necessarily establish that same bond with my colleagues. But in hindsight, I think that should be something that I would do going forward, because building that relationship is just as important as building the student relationship. So yeah, once you said adult, just made sense.
Yeah.
I'm gonna say mine principal.
Please.
The school that I am at, I've been there for a total of 5 years, and that school has been for the past 2 years been sinking.
Hmm.
He came in, hit the ground running with turning around, building stronger family relationships, building stronger relationships amongst staff and students. He also has brought in a lot of programs for the children. So my school goes from pre-K 3 to 8th grade,
Mhm.
and I am with pre-K 4. Even pre-K 4s and pre-K 3 are involved with all the activities that he provides for the school, whereas 2, 3 years ago, it was dry. A lot of parents took their students out, and now that he's there, it's like our enrollment is through the roof.
Wow, that's great. That's great. Do you have any idea what created the space for him to be successful doing that?
Um, Getting a lot of feedback from staff that's been there forever, and with staff in general, the teachers, the other administrators, also the parents as well, and the upper grade level students.
Hmm.
Listen to what they want and they need within their school in order to make this change.
Yeah. And that speaks so much to what's at to what we're talking about here at the core of relationship building and being able to achieve those aspirations and make those contributions is getting to know people. It's being willing to listen and to say, I'm not going to decide for you what you need in order to thrive. I'm going to actually ask you what you need in order to thrive. I'm going to listen to what you have to say and share. Um, and with our students, depending on the ages that they are, that's not always something they're going to be able to give us a detailed 5 paragraph letter explaining. In some cases, they may not necessarily have the vocabulary or the experience to be able to fully articulate what they need. But there are other experiences we can create in the classroom that help them to start developing that and help us to learn more about them. So I'm going to share another activity here that can start building that. And this one, we call it inside outside. And so this is something that you can do. Students can respond to this in writing. They can respond to it in drawing, or as the first question will suggest, with colors. So I'm going to call out 4 different prompts, and just on a piece of scrap paper, or you can keep it in your mind, think about your responses to these prompts. So the first one, if I were a color, outside my color would be, what would it be? And inside my color would be. So think about what your color would be outside and what your color would be inside. If I were an animal, outside I would be a blank. Inside I would be, if I were a musical instrument, outside I would be, and inside I would be. And last for this round, if I were the weather, outside I would be, and inside I would be. So just take a moment to look at what you wrote there. And if you were doing something like this with your students, even if it was something that you were doing with them, with your littlest students, a conversation you have with them one-on-one, or possibly something that you send home for them to have a conversation with their caregivers, what are some things that you might learn from, or how might you use the information you get from an activity like this to help you think about your students and get to know them better?
I think there's the potential that it would point to how they think they need to be and act and show up and outside, and then how they really would truly want to be and act and show up, and that at times that could be in conflict with each other. At times maybe it's unified, and so that's sort of an interesting thing to then get curious about.
Absolutely. And it's interesting because it's kind of a fun activity, but it's actually an activity that, particularly as a teacher, might actually inspire a number of other conversations you might want to have with your students. Did you notice anything when you were doing this reflection yourself that surprised you?
I noticed that my weather was the same. My weather would be the same either way. I lean towards my favorite colors for the color. Animal, I lean towards the inside would be my softer animal, and the outside would be my, more active animal. And then the musical instrument, I couldn't decide. It was tough. But this would be a great icebreaker for, like, say, to get to know colleagues, because you just never know what someone's thinking, but you can always gauge from just doing an activity that it helps you get to know them inside and out.
Absolutely. And sharing something that feels kind of silly, like what animal you are on the outside and what animal you are on the inside. Particularly if you're doing this with colleagues and you're using it as an activity to get to know one another better, following up with a question of, how did you choose those animals? What do those animals mean to you? What is that about? Or, oh, I noticed that we both chose a bird, or we both chose a snake. How did you choose? What does that animal mean to you, and what does that animal mean to me? So it can be a real conversation starter. A lot of times when I do this activity, I start with a drawing exercise where you draw two pictures of yourself, one, the way you look, and two, the way you feel. So this is, again, a really interesting way just to think about this idea that we contain multitudes. We are not just one way at one time, one way another time. And I think that's part of the joy and the challenge of those first weeks of school, because our students are not one dimensional. It'd be really nice if you're a penguin all the time and you're a giraffe all the time. That might give me some idea, but no, we're all these things at different times, and helping our students to giving them the permission to also recognize that about themselves gives us lots of clues, and also gives them their peers some insights. So doing an activity like this where they get to share with one another can also help your students to get to know each other better too. One thing we did that several of you who are on with us tonight were part of this summer, which is one of my favorite activities for getting to know our students, getting to know ourselves, getting to share with one another really quickly, is what I call me museums. And so these are some examples of what happened this summer when we were working with teachers. The instructions were to go home and to bring 3 items that represented your own social and emotional growth as a person, like your own experiences with social, emotional growth and learning. That was the prompt. And then you had index cards that you wrote as sort of narratives to explain each of those items, so that when people walked around the museum of the space that we were in, they could learn about what those items were, even if the person wasn't standing next to them. I've seen teachers do things when they do this in their classroom, and here's some examples from classrooms. They look very similar. In classrooms, I've seen it done where if you split the class in half, one day half of the class sets up their museums, and then they get to actually stand next to their exhibit so that other people can come and ask questions and learn about it. And then you switch, and the other half does their exhibits so that they can speak about what they have. This is also an activity that families can be involved in having them think about what they want to bring into the classroom. It is something that you also want to have some other conversations around, in terms of making sure that you're in a space where students respect each other's belongings, because I have seen it go south where you don't want something to disappear from a museum exhibit. So those are kinds of things you need to set up ahead of time in the classroom. In the examples you see, both that we did with colleagues this summer and then with these examples right here, there are multiple objects in the museum depending on your students, their ages and the time that you have. It can also be done with a singular object. It can also be something that you can do regularly. And if we have any folks who are joining us tonight who teach high school, I know looking at these images and seeing stuffed animals and such, you might think, well, this seems like an elementary activity, but it is a thing that I feel very passionate about. High schoolers love to share things. So do not in any way erase the possibility, because high schoolers do like to share things. They don't always remember to bring them in, but a variation on a me museum might be something like sharing a personal playlist. So sharing the 3 songs that you're listening to on repeat right now, or sharing a phrase or a quote that means a lot to you. So there are ways of doing it that might not necessarily be dependent on objects, but the objects are really meaningful because there's something about having something concrete there and then someone's description of why it matters to them that tends to make this, every single time I've ever seen this done, it's powerful. And I've seen it done with all different grade levels. And as a high school teacher, it's something that I did with my students. So I love a me museum. It's a great way to start out the year. And if you are an administrator or you are working with colleagues in the building, it's a really powerful way to get to know one another too. We like sharing. That's why I know high schoolers like doing it. We like doing it as adults. It's exciting to be able to share things that mean something to us. It does require some prep, so people, you want to give people a heads up if it's something that they have to bring in. But I've actually even done this before with we did it once in the summer where it was during COVID and we were doing our institutes outside. And so it was a rigmarole for people to get themselves to the place. I remember we were at the Kenilworth Aquatic Gardens. And there, what people had to do was find something that was on their person already. It would be something that was in there. It might be a piece of clothing, a piece of jewelry, something that was in their bag, something that was on their person already that was important and meaningful to them and to share why. And that was frankly just as powerful because we carry things with us everywhere, even something that doesn't seem like it has a lot of significance when we're asked to pause and reflect on it. Can hold a lot of significance, and the act of sharing something that is personal to me with others, while also, like Meg's example at the beginning that she did with her middle school students, giving people choice where they get to pick what it is they're going to share. They get to make that selection. It's a beautiful combination of autonomy and creating a sense of belonging at the same time. So the next thing we're going to think about is things to think about with parents. So family connections. And I'm wondering, Sabrina talked a little bit about that she does do home visits. I know that's not something that all schools do. Someone else was sharing sending letters home or getting letters back from families. A lot of times there are surveys and things that you do. What I've shared right here are just some questions that maybe you're already asking, but I know that as a parent, the opportunity to kind of brag on what you love and like and find interesting about your child's aspirations and contributions, it actually feels really good to be able to talk about what their strengths are and be able to tell someone, because it feels like I have this opportunity to tell you about this really important person in my life. So I just encourage you to think about questions you can ask that will give family members, caregivers, whoever they happen to be for the children, the opportunity to kind of share those highlights. And this question right here, what delights your child, is actually that's a question that I ask people all over in my life. It's actually a question that I use when I check references for people that we're bringing on staff. I find that it's a fun question to ask, and it's a great way to get to know people in a different way. So If you're not asking that one, test it out and tell me how that goes. But what are some other ways that you, things that you already are asking families that you found effective? Or over here on the right, I'm giving a couple of suggestions for different ways to keep the dialogue going during the year. What are some ways that you all have found effective to build those relationships with caregivers, and recognizing that caregivers come in all shapes and forms, and communication varies depending on who and how you're communicating with them. So I see Sabrina put in hopes and dreams for family homework. Yes, I love those surveys. Ooh, a monthly video montage. Do you put together, it's videos of things that the students have done in class?
Yes, we started doing it during COVID because the parents couldn't come in the building, and I've just been doing it ever since.
That's great. That's so exciting. It's such a great way to be able to bring families in to what's happening in the classroom. A lot of
Really
work.
sad when they couldn't come in, so that was what inspired it.
We got into the practice of allowing our kids to make the phone calls home. That was a celebration. So, rather than putting it on you, the teacher, to remember to do right, if there's like something amazing, then you actually just find that little moment right in that day to allow the child to call and say, hey, and you're present. But again, it sort of shifts the ownership to the child, and that was very successful.
Oh, I love that. And so exciting for them to be able to, yeah, what a great way to put them in the driver's seat of being able to also share their own successes. This last one right here is one that I also want to highlight. Share things that are working in your relationship building and give parents new tools. Particularly if you are in early childhood and you're teaching the youngest students, working with the youngest students. A person that changed my life was I had the same preschool teacher for my children. She was in our lives for 6 years, and that person was an absolute like co-parent. She was a person who taught me how to be a parent. That teacher did, because she was very transparent about the things that she was doing with the students, and she would share with me, here's something that I found worked with your child. And I was so grateful for the fact that I had this opportunity to learn with her, but it wasn't in a way that was like, she was very careful. It was never saying, you don't know what you're doing. It was, I just want to share with you something that I'm finding that's working in my experience. So you have to kind of approach it with the right tone so it doesn't feel like, it doesn't make parents feel defensive. But goodness knows, particularly when you're just trying to figure out how to be a parent, any tools and resources that can be shared with you, it's like gold. You're so excited to be able to find these new ways of thinking about how to do this thing with this. And as a teacher, the reality is, you have worked with, if you're teaching a 5-year-old, you have worked with hundreds of 5-year-olds. But this caregiver is just maybe experiencing this 5-year-old for the very first time. So if there are things that you are finding that are working in your classroom, and there's a way to share them with families, that can be so helpful. And it's a really interesting way also to keep the door open. So we'll share in a follow-up email links to all of these things, but here's a couple things that you might use that we actually have available, that these are examples of some things that you could share with families. So we have a framework called the ABCDE of learner needs that focuses on the core needs that students must have met in order to be motivated to learn. And again, I'll share links. We have a whole guidebook with lots of resources in it. But I wanted to share these just as an example of some things that something in this kind of format might be really useful for a parent. So over here on the left, you see a grid where we've identified these different needs and then examples of how you might actually meet those. So if I want to create more autonomy, I want my students to practice decision making, I'm looking for more opportunities for them to be able to make choices. I'm looking for chances for them to be able to express themselves. I'm looking for space for them to move around freely and practice independence. So as a educator communicating with a family, it might be something like in your newsletter or whatever that you send home. We've been working on students being able to take more responsibility for their learning environment and to have more autonomy in the classroom. Here are some things we're doing in our classroom. At home, this might look like letting them put the silverware away when they unload the dishwasher. At home, this might look like letting them choose what music they want to listen to when you're having dinner. So giving some of those examples where you're translating what's working in the classroom for home. And we actually have within the ABCDE of Learner Needs Guidebook, a whole list that's just like that over here that you see on the right. So we'll share that resource with you, but that's just kind of a model of the sorts of things that I think can be really helpful to create that bridge between home and school. Similarly, if you're working with older students, middle schoolers, high schoolers, families need all the tools that they can get. They just are continually trying to figure out what they do with these young people that keep changing in front of them. So sharing things like, here are the kinds of questions that I've been asking students that have really been eliciting a lot of responses. Or we had a really interesting conversation in class today about this song that the students are listening to. You might hear them talking about it. Here are some questions you might ask at home that could continue that conversation. And you might frame it as, even if this is music we don't like, sometimes that can be a touch point where we can actually open a conversation with our students. So here's some ways to think about having that conversation. So that's just, it's obviously your main focus and job is teaching the students, but knowing that what you're doing in the classroom can continue to grow at home can be part of building those relationships and getting to know them better. All right. So shifting gears a bit, I had a number of experiences over the last couple of weeks that made me think that a tool like this could be useful. And I know there are variations on this that exist already. But I was thinking about how in our homes, we have all kinds of equipment that come with operating instructions that tell us how to make sure that the blender does what it's supposed to do. And at the back of those operating instructions, there's always something that's the troubleshooting that tells you what to do when it isn't working. And it occurred to me, and Sabrina's example in the beginning of talking about creating all these mindfulness spaces and practices in the classroom, those are kind of like the what to do when something's not working. Those are strategies for how to help myself when I'm in an experience where I'm feeling really out of sorts or wound up or unfocused or having a hard time. In your classroom, you're giving them strategies for doing that, but helping students to really be able to name that helps them transfer that skill out of something that they just do in your class into something that they might take in their lives beyond the classroom. So this is just a handout that I'll send you all, and I kind of envision it being something you could fold into a book on an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. It's also a way of kind of helping our students to create a space for them to talk about their aspirations and their contributions. So when we're thinking about asset framing, we don't have to come up with all of that on our own. We can create the space for our students to share who they are with us so that we can learn that about them. So this, in the quote box at the bottom, it says, what makes me an asset to the community? There's probably a whole lot of vocabulary learning that has to be part of that, but that's a way for students to think about themselves as contributors, as people who bring something of value to the learning environment, and having them think about how to name that and describe that. This would be sort of the inside. This is what I envision as the operation manual. And so again, questions to ask our students. There's all sorts of conversations you might need to have to help prime the pump for this. But giving your students an opportunity to really tell you about what they need from you in order to be able to thrive in the classroom. So what are 3 ways that you, teacher, or I myself, can engage my own mind? What are ways that I can engage my body? What are ways to make me feel connected in the classroom? And really asking students, creating the space for them to share what works for them. And imagine what happens if you have that for all of your students. There may be a fair amount of repetition, and some of them may not necessarily know how to answer those questions at the start, but that's okay. It can be something that can kind of be a working document. And then this part right here in the corner, 4 words that describe me, is another way. This is something that's used in a lot of coaching, and as adults, it's something that we think about a lot when we kind of need to reframe ourselves or ground ourselves and what's our purpose, what's our vision, what are we here for. But why don't we ask our students the same thing and give them that starting space for thinking about who they are and how they relate to their learning the world around them. So I'm going to ask us just to try that one for ourselves, because it's an activity that you can do many times and the answers might be different. But I'll ask you just to take a moment just to imagine yourself in the shoes of your students if you did this activity with them, and think about 4 words that describe you as a person. If you just take a moment to jot those down, and then we'll talk a little bit about what you notice in doing that. What did you notice? What was hard about thinking of those 4 words, or what popped out immediately when you tried to do it? What did you notice for yourself?
4 words that describe me is passionate, caring, understanding, and motivated.
And did those come to you right away?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. When you think about those 4 words, do you feel like those are words that other people understand about you?
Yes.
Yeah.
They see, and I say that is because of the interaction that I have with my students, and not just my students in my class, but the other students all the way up to the 8th grade, as well as each and every parent within the building, and not within my class.
And so, given those words, if I think about myself, if I am your teacher and I'm working with a student who lists those words, that's important for me to know those are words that my student use to describe themselves. So if we're doing something in class and they seem completely disconnected, they're not engaged in it, but I know that this is someone who sees themselves as passionate, who sees themselves as motivated, then that's a real flag for me. And I got to sit down and I got to have a conversation and be like, hey, tell me what's happening. I know you are someone who brings motivation to what you do, and it's not happening right now. Let's see what is happening. What are we not doing that's getting in the way of you being able to be motivated?
I like this. Are we getting a copy of this?
Yep.
Oh.
You're getting a copy of everything. Yes, yeah, absolutely. And
This is something I can do at home too.
yes, yes, absolutely. I feel like it's super helpful, and to overdo the metaphor, because that is what I love to do. And I actually think this is also very important for our students to know. Things get updates, right? We work with so many materials these days, like our phones, that are constantly getting an update. And when our phone gets an update, there are things that don't work the same way that they did before. And then we need to go back to our operating instructions and figure out how it works in this new iteration. And that same thing happens to us as human beings, right? We experience trauma, we have new stress that comes about in our life, we have some kind of major life change. And I think it's a useful thing for our students to understand that operating instructions are malleable. They keep changing, they keep updating based on these things that happen. But think about how powerful it could be for students if this is a way that they think about their thinking, they think about their experiences, and you're creating the space both for them to be able to share this, to recognize this as a tool for how to be successful in learning with you in your classroom, and also to recognize that it's not fixed. The ways that you engage my mind this year might be very different next year. And that's okay. That's part of being a human being I keep getting updates, just like all these other devices and things that I work with in my life do. So if you try that out, let me know. I'm excited to see it. It has worked out in conversations that I've had with people, but I'm really interested to see how this might work out in your work, just both for yourself and then if it's something that you use or adapt with your students. All right. So as we're closing in here, we're gonna shift out of the interpersonal relationships to think about the space in which learning happens. And I recognize that this is tricky because some of us might be in classrooms where we don't have a dedicated space. We might be traveling from room to room. Some of us might be in schools where the classroom configuration has to be the same from one classroom to the next. So I just want to preface this by saying that I recognize that we're all from very different experiences. But I want to share a couple of images and questions with you just to think about when you think about how you're setting up your learning environment for this coming year. So the first place I always start is, what does the desk configuration communicate about relationships? And in this image, we're just seeing desks in rows. But even in classrooms, I find that there's a lot that can be said based on where a teacher's desk is or isn't in the room. Whether a room, particularly in elementary grades, has a space, has flexible spaces. There's places where you're sitting at tables, but then there's also places where I might be able to sit on the floor. What kinds of chairs do I have in the classroom? What kinds of seating options do I have? So just thinking about how that furniture in the room, what does that communicate about relationships? And I'm wondering, has anybody done experiments with the way you've set up the furniture in your room that you found particularly effective in either helping to build relationships, or you tried something and it didn't really work in terms of furniture? Again, recognizing that there's only so much you can do with the room that you're in.
When I started the school year at a new school, I had to kind of navigate the idea of what was allowed and what wasn't allowed. And one of the things that I found, so I've taught at schools in 2 different states. So this was transitioning from Texas to Louisiana. And when I was in Texas, we didn't have desks in the classroom. And I found that actually really worked well for me, because it had me just with the kids at all times. And so I decided that honestly, I didn't need a desk. And so when I got to my new school, whichever room I was assigned, I just let them know, if there's a desk in there, I don't need it. You can give it to a teacher who would like it. And it proved to be very valuable, because when I was communicating with kids, I was getting on their level. But then also when they saw me working, I was working in a space that was similar to the space that they were working in. And so I was showing them that, modeling for them that we can get work done in this space that we've been provided in ways that's meaningful and encouraging, without having to worry about them thinking that I'm just sitting behind my desk and not having that time for developing the relationships and spending time with them on the other side of the desk.
Thank you so much. Yes, I love that story, and also the ways in which you saw how it changed your movement around the room. Again, sometimes we don't have that option, and sometimes a teacher's desk doubles as a place for having conferences with students. So there's all different configurations that work. We have an Inspired Teaching Fellow who was in our program last year, who actually removed all desks from her classroom, but it was a whole process to make that happen. She had to go through a lot of different permission structures to be able to get to a place where she removed them entirely. But she was a language teacher, and she realized that the desks were getting in the way of kind of whole body learning around language, that in order for students to really understand how parts of speech worked and think about embodying the words that they were learning, they needed to have a lot of room to move around. And so she used carpet squares instead of tables and chairs in her middle school classroom to do that. So there are that's kind of a far out there example of someone taking their classroom setup to a whole different extreme. Next question is, where can students have input? So just something to experiment before I leave the furniture setup. Something to experiment with, something to wonder about, something to think about. Are there some little ways that you might experiment with setup, particularly as you think about how the placement of furniture in the room affects relationships? The next one is, where can students have input on what is displayed in the room? I know there is a huge impulse to get everything looking pristine and beautiful and fill up bulletin boards and and put up the posters and things in the classroom. But sometimes some of the most effective relationship building setups that I have seen in a classroom is to have a classroom be completely blank at the start of the very start of the school year, and then really intentionally building in activities in those first couple of weeks where students are co-creating the ways that the walls are covered. So they're creating posters about themselves. They're putting up, Sabrina talked about the wall with photos of different of their families. They are, creating word walls, but things where the students are actually really playing an active role in creating the space. Does anybody have an example of something they found effective in that way that you want to share?
Well, what I do with my students, we have, my curriculum is Every Child Ready, ECR. So we have units, I believe it's 10 units, 11 units is the parents work with them throughout the summertime with that last unit. But each unit, I do a project with I'll send home a project for the parents and the students to do. They will bring that project in and I will post it up around the classroom. At the beginning of the school year, my boards do look like this, but it'll have the name of each center in it. By the end of the school year, I have things everywhere from their creativity, home projects and class projects up on the wall.
I love that. And it's making me also think about, I'm combining that in my head with Sabrina's video montages that she makes. And I'm thinking about how neat it would be to show students a before and after. This is what the classroom looked like in September. Now look what it looks like at the end of the year, because they're part of making that. Like it's something that you have created together. This is something that this next one is something that we're actually going to be talking about. I hope that all of you are subscribed to Hooray for Monday, which is our weekly resource that we send out with activities and ideas and resources and reflections for the classroom. And in August, we're going to be talking a little bit in one of our Hooray for Mondays about creating a classroom constitution. But the question I have here is, how might student input shape classroom expectations? So again, just something to ponder. Your school may already have a set of rules and expectations that everybody's asked to use in their classrooms. But even within that, are there places where students' input can be part of creating the expectations for the classroom? Or even if there's rules that the school has, are there ways that students can provide their own language for what those rules, how they understand those rules, what they mean to them? And so doing activities like that in the beginning, again, you're going to learn more about your students as they have an opportunity to share what they want their classroom learning environment to look like. And then they will also provide opportunities for the students to feel ownership over the learning environment. Does anybody do slippers in their classroom? I think this is the cutest thing. I've only seen it done in a couple of places, but this is just an image to think about what can make the space feel more comfortable. So I have seen classrooms where students bring in their own slippers or something like that for the classroom. Another way to sort of very physically transform that I'm coming into a space where I feel comfortable or welcome, or maybe they put their slippers on when they're doing independent reading time, but it doesn't have to be that. Sabrina, again, in the opening, shared with us a lot of ways in which she's creating a Zen corner or a corner of her room where students know that they can go to be able to decompress, to find peace, to find stillness and relaxation and comfort. But just thinking about, what are those spaces in my classroom? What can I do to make it a space where I feel comfortable? Because we know we're hardwired not to be able to learn when we're in the alarm zone, and your classroom is probably very infrequently in the alarm zone. But we actually learn quite well when we're in a space where our needs feel met and we feel comfortable. Then we're a little bit more primed to be able to try new things, because we feel like we're in a space that is welcoming and respectful of who we are. So just thinking about what are some touches you might be able to put in place in your classroom to do that. And then the last one here is, how can I ensure students see themselves reflected in the space? So that means lots of different things. We'll send you, again, a link to this image you see at the top, has these pictures in it. This is something we did with teachers this summer. We do this in all of our institutes where we're with teachers for multiple days. They're called profile pages. And so it's a picture and then a bunch of prompts that you answer around the page, and these go up on the wall. And they're, like a lot of things that folks have shared tonight, just a way for students to actually physically see themselves. Their picture is up there, their words are up there, see themselves reflected on the wall. And it's also a great way for students to be able to learn about each other. So I can walk around the room and I can see what other people have said about themselves on these posters and get to know my peers in that way. And then another example of seeing themselves reflected in the space. This is another soapbox I love to get on, but luckily so many people have been on it for the last, I'd say, like decade. We're getting a lot better at this. But if you have a classroom library, making sure that the books that are in your classroom library reflect all the different ways to be a human in the world, so that if students come into your classroom, they can see themselves reflected in books. It's really important as a gesture of creating comfort and community in the classroom, and also having books on there that are different from who your students are, so they get to learn about other people too. But thinking about things like our classroom library is another important way to have students see themselves reflected. Are there other things that you do in your classroom already that help students see themselves reflected in the room?
So in the Zen zone that I have, there is, I have the feelings poster, and I also have little mirrors. So not only are you thinking about how you're feeling, but you're seeing how you're feeling. So I think the mirrors were really helpful this year, because I felt like if you can feel your emotion, but if you see how you're feeling, it's something totally different.
Oh my gosh, I love that. And talk about seeing yourself reflected. I hadn't really thought about that before, but having mirrors in the room is a really interesting way to do that, and especially in a space like that. Oh my goodness. I
Yeah,
think of
I had to remove some of them for safety, but just in the Zen zone, we had a really nice one that was in a safe frame, and it was just very reflective of how students were feeling.
I love that. That's beautiful.
Thank you for mentioning mirrors. You just reminded me that I need to get some for my class.
Oh, listen, I live at the dollar store. It's a thing.
That's where I'm going.
That's perfect. All right, so I've thrown a lot at you. Like I said, you're going to get an email that will have all the things that I've shared, including this slide deck. And if you have any questions, I hope that you'll reach out, because I would love to keep learning with you, and also hear how this all goes, how it goes in your classroom. Is there one thing, it doesn't have to be something that we covered tonight, it could be something else that you already have in your mind. Is there one thing that you are thinking that you want to try as the school year starts, a new thing that you want to try to build relationships with your students?
I'm gonna do the I think you call it a profile page.
Mm-hmm.
I've always done it as an adult, but I'm gonna do that for my kids. We normally do it in All About Me, but I'm gonna put the profile page in the kid museum if I can find a place to put that. So that's a goal.
I love it. That sounds great. And that's nice because yes, like the museums, if they create those kinds of things, you can't always keep those up all the time. But the nice thing with a profile page is it's a flat thing that stays on the wall.
I too like your idea about operating instructions and understanding that my instructions might be different than your instructions or somebody else's, and to sort of make that known, like, here's what works for me when, and to have that be something that's shared, I think seems like it has a lot of potential.
I'm going to well, I'll have majority of my students that I had last year. Last year I had pre-K threes. They're going over to pre-K four, so I'll be moving over with them. And I had these parents to do on some use Canvas, they use the other not a regular poster board, but it was thick. Oh, I have one right here. My students told me I can have it. So last year, one of my students I had them to do an all about me board,
Oh,
and she did this one right here. So when they opened it up, and last year was her very first year attending a public school. Um, and I'm sure I have quite a few this year. Some I have them to do something like this, or even I told them get creative. I'm not going to tell you what to do. Get creative, but add a little more at home feel to it. What do they love to do at home? What do they love to play with at home? Super glue that bad boy on here so they can have something to go to look at, to remind them that, okay, I'm at school and I see everything and everyone that I love here. I'll see them later.
yeah, that's beautiful. I love it. And Sabrina, that's reminding me you have to share your letter writing station.
I don't actually have it in front of me, but yeah, I will definitely do that. I basically bought like a letter sorter, a little note with it has little slots for, it's really pretty actually. I got it at Goodwill, but it has little slots for cards. So I went to the dollar store and I got thank you notes and blank notes, and all of it has like little hearts or funny faces or smileys or these beautiful colors and flowers. So I thought I was going to put that into my like little writing station. I also bought from IKEA. They had $3 markers, so I bought some little thin markers so they can make colors, and I'll probably add stickers to those, just build it out as the year goes on, because my students necessarily don't come with writing skills, but they can draw. Um, so it's always good when they come across the threshold and they miss mommy or miss grandma or they miss their puppy. They can write a letter or draw a picture for them.
I love that. Yeah, I was, Juanita, when you were sharing the that board, it was making me think of that combined. If they go, they can see that touchstone with their families and where they are, and if they're still feeling sad, they could go and create this little note. I loved that idea as an action step you can take when you're having that feeling of missing. And again, another toolkit in my operating instructions. When I feel sad and I'm missing my family, here's a thing that I do. That's a tool, a resource that I have available to me. It has been a joy to learn with you all tonight, sending you all lots of positive vibes, chances to recharge and rest these last couple days before you head into the classroom, and a beautiful new school year ahead of you. Thank you all for joining us tonight.